Much for joining us. My name is Marcia Feliciano. I am director of Benjamin Franklin House in London, and it is our pleasure and honor to welcome to this edition of Ben's Digital Book Club, Harlow Giles Unger. And Harlow has written quite prolifically on many of the founding fathers. There's about 27 books and 10 biographies, among them Patrick Henry, Lion of Liberty, James Monroe, the last founding father, the award-winning Lafayette, who don't know already, who is a journalist, broadcaster, educator. So I wanted to get started by asking, you've written about so many of the founders and interesting figures in American history. What captivated your interest and attention about Thomas Paine?
Thomas Paine was a lightning rod when in American history. He arrived as a nobody, having only recommendations from Benjamin Franklin, whom he had met and gotten to know in London. Franklin had basically patronized Paine as a writer and someone with a great deal of interest in science and engineering. They had that in common. And the other thing they had in common was that they were both autodidacts. Benjamin Franklin had educated himself, and so had Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine had studied in and listened to lectures in the Royal Society of London. So he was a self-educated man and got along famously with Franklin. When Franklin was dismissed by Parliament for defending the colonies in their incipient rebellion against taxation, he advised Paine, knowing Paine's views, he advised Paine to go to America. And indeed, he subsidized Paine's trip to America. Once here, the revolution was already underway. His work did not incite the revolution. The revolution actually started in 1770. Paine didn't arrive until 1774. By then, there had been a great deal of turmoil in Boston, the so-called Boston Massacre, the famous Boston Tea Party, in which mobs threw British tea, cases of British tea overboard from ships arriving in Boston. And everybody thinks there was just that one tea party, but there were two in Boston. And the tea party phenomenon spread up and down the East Coast. There were tea parties in New York Harbor, in Baltimore, in Philadelphia, and in Charleston. And then fighting broke out in Massachusetts. The Revolutionary War was underway. Massachusetts, and remember, the colonies in Massachusetts were each independent. There was no relationship between them. They had very little communication between each other. The war broke out, the Revolutionary War, or War of Independence, broke out in Massachusetts outside of Boston in two towns called Lexington and Concord. Patrick Henry, a leader in Virginia, learned of it and called on Virginia to join in the fighting and to declare independence. And Virginia declared independence. And this is all in 1775. In January 1776, Paine, who by then was an editor of a magazine in Philadelphia, and whose articles had attracted quite a bit of attention. He had become quite a popular writer. The magazine circulation, he took over the magazine from scratch, and by early 1776, the circulation was well above 800, which was enormous in those days, in a country of semi-literate or illiterate people. And he then, in January of 1776, wrote his famous pamphlet called Common Sense, which put into words the feelings of a largely illiterate population. The Americans, the British settlers who had come over to America had settled with the proviso, with the unwritten agreement with the British, with the British government, that they could sell all their goods, if they agreed to sell all of their goods to English merchants, they could keep all of their proceeds free of charge and free of taxes. Well, the 7 Years' War from 1756 to 63 bankrupted the British government. At first, the British tried taxing British farmers. The farmers rebelled, and Parliament repealed that tax, decided to tax Americans. Now, suddenly, the government was demanding taxes from these settlers who had spent their forebears, and they had spent more than a century tax-free. And to them, it was confiscation. George Washington put it very simply: they, the British government, have no right to put their hands in my pocket. And so the revolution was underway. But 95% of American people were illiterate. Thomas Paine, Common Sense, put into writing the feelings they had, the objections they had to British rule. This, as he put it, this little island has no right to govern an entire continent 5,000 miles away across the sea. So that was the importance of Thomas Paine. He did not incite the revolution. He merely verbalized the unwritten feelings of a large segment of the American population.
A lot has been written about Paine. So what was your feeling as you started to write about the contribution you wanted to make to the literature about him?
Well, the most famous book in America about Thomas Paine was written in 1943. That was the most complete book, and it was what they called historical fiction. It was written almost as a novel. It was very popular. Bestseller. It was made into a play on Broadway, but it was fiction, largely fiction. Since then, many very, very fine compendia have been published of his articles and written works. And these compendia all include short biographies, not complete ones. And the few biographies that have been written have been incomplete. And they all leave out a huge part of Paine's life, and indeed what he considered his greatest work. He only wrote 2 books, full-length books. Common Sense was a pamphlet, and his famous articles, which put together are called American Crisis. American Crisis is a book-length work, but it's made up of individual articles, each of them written separately at different times during the Revolutionary War. He wrote only 2 books. This one, The Rights of Man, in which he decries hereditary rule, monarchy, what gives the baby of some individual the right to govern a nation is one of the questions he asks. And some of the writings in Rights of Man went into the American Declaration of Independence and the American Constitution, and it really gave the French all of the words of the preamble of their Constitution, which is called the Rights of Man, les droits de l'homme. And this book was very important in that sense, in the sense of establishing popular republics. But he considered his greatest work, The Age of Reason. and it's the longest work, and it's a full-length book, in which he savages all religions, saying that they were simply continuations of the age of mythology. The Greeks had Zeus, the Romans had Jupiter, the Jews invented what they called God, the Christians invented the Son of God, and the Mohammedans invented the Prophet of God. And Paine, Thomas Paine, was a deist. He believed probably in a God, but certainly a higher authority, as did most of the American founding fathers. And just as American publishers really ignored Thomas Paine. Here's a 900-page textbook, standard textbook of American history in secondary schools in America. 900 pages, and all of that, this image of common sense and one little paragraph beneath it is all there is about Thomas Paine. That's all you can find. And there's a good reason for that. The publishing industry sells 500,000 Bibles a year. In addition to the Bible, the publishing industry produces 500,000 religious books a year. They do not want to injure that market. And of course, the leaders of organized religions don't want anything about Thomas Paine, especially the Age of Reason, to be publicized. And in it, as I say, he savages all religions. He says nothing in the New Testament is written by Christ. If he had wanted us to start a religion, he would have written about it. Paine says that if everything that Christ is said to have said, and what he is said to have said was written centuries after his life by people who had no contact with him, if that was all, if he spoke in languages that went across the earth, how did he miss America? Why is there no mention of America in anywhere in the Bible? Because the world was flat in those days, and it ended at the edge of the European continent. And then in his savaging of Christianity, he says it's outrageous, the idea of God killing his own son to make mankind better. It's murder. It's savagery. That doesn't make the world a better place. So the Age of Reason was ignored by almost all authors. If it was mentioned, that's all. It was mentioned with a one sentence description of what it discussed. But it was avoided like the plague by publishers, by organized religion. And I just felt they're not telling the story of Thomas Paine without telling the story of the Age of Reason. This took up the last part of his life. He thought this was his greatest work. And of course, it alienated most of the Western world. But interestingly enough, the same publishers, same religious authorities, they failed to mention that most of the founding fathers, Washington, Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, were, like Paine, were deists. Now, they didn't rail against religion the way Paine did, but they were deists. Franklin was a Freemason, so was Washington. Washington carefully, in all of his speeches, all of his writings, he never uses the word God, or let alone Christ. He only speaks of providence. He asks providence to guide the nation. He asked Providence to do this, to do that, to help win the war. Providence, never God. So, and Jefferson was quite outspoken. He wrote a whole thesis on deism and against religion. But this is never mentioned in history textbooks, let alone biographies of the major figures in that of that day. And I just thought it was time to write about it and tell the truth. There's a tendency to change history for propaganda reasons in all ages. And doing that doesn't change history. It just distorts it and distorts the thinking of otherwise decent people.
Well, I wonder if you could tell us something about his upbringing. Was he destined to write great books like Common Sense?
No, not at all. I'm not quite sure what you mean by destined, but no, he was a poor boy in this little town, Thetford, about 75 miles north of London. A farming community, as most communities were in Britain at that time. And his father was a Quaker. And they went to the Quaker meeting house. And I don't know if you know the procedures in Quaker meeting houses of that day, but they would all sit, the congregation would just sit in silence, hour after hour after hour, waiting for God to speak to them through one of the parishioners. And the silence would be broken. Some parishioner would stand up and proclaim something or other as the word of God, and sit down. No applause, no hymns, nothing, just silence until someone else stood up. Well, the meeting house in Thetford happened to be near the stocks. And in the stocks were women and men, occasionally teenagers, who would be in the stocks as punishment. Of course, their hands and their wrists and ankles tied down in between these big blocks of wood. And they would cry out for water, for help, for anyone to help them. I mean, their cries were just, and often screams were just penetrated Paine's being. And so sitting there waiting for the word from God, he grew up hearing these horrible screams for help. And that turned him off and absolutely closed his mind against religion of all sorts. Well, he didn't know about the other religions as a boy, but as he grew up and learned of the other religions, he just absolutely thought they were all vicious and indeed evil, and had no sense of humanity in them. Now, he didn't start out writing. His father was a corset his father made stays, these made of whale bones that made corsets stiff, and women wore them to give them a wasp figure of a wasp. The waist would be tied down in these corsets. And he learned making stays, and eventually quit and went into, got another job, eventually landing a job in the customs, as a customs officer, which was fraught with corruption because they could, brewers would, the customs officer would go in the brewery and charge the customs duty on the basis of how much, how far down the tank of beer had gone since the last time he was there. So that was the amount of beer that had been sold or ale that had been sold, and the customs duties would be imposed on that basis. Well, the brewers would bribe customs officers not to show up and just issue minimum taxes. And he was one of them, and he tried to avoid accepting any bribes. But what got him notoriety was he was very popular among the customs officials in his town, and they wanted higher wages from the government. He wrote the petition. By then, he had started writing short articles for the local papers in Lewis, and so they saw that he was a good writer. He wrote the petition and took it up to Parliament. Parliament rejected the petition and fired him from the Customs Service, just at the time Franklin was being dismissed as agent for the American states. Apparently Franklin took notice of this petition, thought the writing was very, very good, the logic was very, very good, and I'm not sure who, and no one knows who saw it out, but Franklin and Paine met, and Franklin had taken a number of young people under his wing while in England. Paine was not young, but he was young in terms of experience, and Franklin guided him and urged him to go to the United States, to America, it wasn't the United States. So that's how he came to America. But there's no sense of destiny there. The first job he was able to get, he was given an introduction to the biggest bookstore in Philadelphia, the owner of the biggest bookstore. Franklin gave him an introduction, and saying that he had written articles for local newspapers in England. Well, the bookstore owner was just trying to start a new magazine and found the obligations of running a magazine and running a bookstore just too onerous, and asked Franklin, did he think he could start this magazine? And Frank asked Paine if he could start that magazine. Paine said yes, and he did a good job. He wrote beautiful articles, usually entertaining articles, nothing political at first. And he built the circulation, as I say, became quite popular, built the circulation about 800, which is enormous in those days. And then the opportunity to write Common Sense came up, and he started that. So there was no sense of destiny there. He really just drifted into that kind of work, as most people in that, most uneducated people in that era did.
So I wanted to ask you, if there had been no common sense, would there have been an American Revolution?
Oh yes, absolutely. As I say, the revolution was well underway when Paine arrived in America. He arrived, I think, in late in '74, and the beginnings of the seeds of the revolution were laid. The first incidents of the revolution began in 1770, in March of 1770, with what was called the Boston Massacre. A group of protesters went and demonstrated in front of the British barracks in Boston. Some British sentry opened fire on them. Other soldiers came out, also fired on the crowd, and 5 or 6 of members of the crowd were killed. They had no arms, of course, and the Boston papers, and eventually all the papers in America, blew it up into what was called the Boston Massacre, and that inflamed public opinion. As British taxation began to take hold, there were more and more protests, which reached a climax in 1773. Again, Paine had not arrived. This was towards Christmas of 1773, when a mob went down to Boston Harbor. 3 British ships, cargo ships loaded with uh, cargo of tea, and they boarded the ships and dumped all the tea overboard, uh, about $1 million worth in today's currency. Uh, the British sent troops to occupy Boston. That inflamed the rest of the public along the East Coast, and tea parties were held in other cities in New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Charleston, where again mobs went down to the harbor, boarded British cargo ships and dumped the cargoes, largely tea, overboard. So the war was really on, and in the spring of '75, the British Army marched marched out of Boston, and engaged what were called Minutemen. These were armed farmers in what is now a suburb of Lexington, Massachusetts. They killed, 21 farmers. They marched on to Concord, and there was skirmishing there. There was skirmishing all the way. The farmers just materialized behind these stone walls and overwhelmed the British force. British were forced to retreat back to Boston. But the war was on, and each of the provinces was independent of all the others. They had no contact with each other. They didn't even know each other. And Massachusetts, which was an independent province of England, they were all called provinces, except for two of them were called commonwealths, but they were independent provinces of England. Massachusetts declared itself independent, an independent little nation. Patrick Henry was one of the political leaders in Virginia, and he inflamed the public with this a speech which ended, "Give me liberty or give me death." It appeared in the press across the colonies. Virginia then declared its independence, so now you had two provinces that had declared independence. This was in the spring of '75. This increased as the year went on. Common Sense came out in January of '76, and in the spring of '76, Richard Henry Lee stood in Congress and proposed the first Declaration of Independence. Congress took about 3 months to debate it, and in July of 1776, they declared independence with the famed Declaration of Independence, which actually came out on July 2nd. And it was printed in the local papers and held up in printers' shops all over the country. They say only 5% of people were literate. Newspapers were usually glued to the inside window of the printer's shop, and a crowd would collect, and some member of the crowd who was literate enough to do so would read it out loud to the other people, and that's how the word spread. As I say, it was actually issued on July 2nd, and John Adams wrote to his wife Abigail, "July 2nd will live in history as the date of independence." Well, of course, it didn't. Somebody got it wrong, and it was July 4th became the national holiday.
Well, that's lucky for me, since I'm born on the 4th of July. It wouldn't be half as fun if it was the 2nd of July.
I know.
One of the things that you talk about in the book is he was more than a century ahead of his time in conceiving and demanding unheard of social reforms that are now integral elements of what we take to be modern society. And these included things like subsidies for the poor, universal housing and education, pre and postnatal care for women, universal social security. Incredible. Where did his inspiration come from, and why did it take so long for those things to become part of the fabric of what we take today to be society?
Well, a lot of that still is not part of the fabric. of most countries in the world. And we're still having problems with equal rights for women in this country. I don't know about what's going on in England, but it's still a struggle for women. And I mean, some of these athletic teams, headlines, the women's soccer team, which has been world champion for 3-4 times years in a row, they still can't get equal pay with the men's soccer team. This is the national team. So we're still struggling with these things. These currents were going on among the certain elements of the intelligentsia when Paine was emerging, going through adulthood, educating himself. The Age of Enlightenment, as it's called, had started in the early 18th century, the early 1700s. So all of these things that he pioneered were on the table, so to speak. They had been explained and elucidated in a number of books. Jean-Jacques Rousseau in France, in his Contrat Social, Social Contract, had espoused all of these things several decades before Paine. Voltaire had espoused these things. Montesquieu had done so. John Locke had written a book, The Rights of Man. So these things were being discussed, but largely by philosophers and the intelligentsia, most of whom were very wealthy themselves, and I assume just felt guilt over the treatment of their own underlings and the serfs across Europe and America. In America, they were called indentured servants, and in America, the slaves who were doing the labor in the South. So these ills of society were evident to anyone with any sense of pity for oppressed peoples. And he just simply joined in with it. He did grow up a Quaker, and the Quakers were known for their general kindness. They did not own slaves. They were against slavery. So he grew up without slaves and with a sense of compassion for people less fortunate than himself. One of the striking moments of his life, great influential life, was the hanging of a 16-year-old girl in Thetford. Every spring, there was the Thetford Assizes, in which the courts would determine who lived or died on the gallows on the top of the hill in Thetford. It became so theatrical. Thousands of Londoners would come up from London, 75 miles away, to see the Thetford Assizes and the hangings. And a girl whom Thomas Paine, much older than Thomas Paine at the time, I think he was 8 or 9 or 10, but he knew her and was deeply hurt and wounded by her death on the gallows.
So one of the things we've talked about, of course, is the Declaration of Independence. And you also make the point that he was friendly not only with Franklin, but others who were very important to the cause of the revolution, like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. What particular ideas in the Declaration of Independence can we link up to Thomas Paine? And before you answer, Harlow, let me just remind our listeners that they can begin to formulate their own questions, because we'll open up things in a few minutes and hear from some of their questions.
One of the things that's difficult for modern readers of history to understand is how small, in modern terms, everything was at the time founding of the United States. Philadelphia was barely 2 miles in diameter. So you could walk from one end to the other. You got to know everybody in town, and everybody knew you. So the idea of spreading ideas the way they're done today via the media. There really were no media. The media in that day and age was word of mouth from person to person to person to person. And one of the founding fathers, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, also a friend of Benjamin Franklin, who he actually studied medicine, a doctor. He studied medicine at the University of Edinburgh. Was Benjamin Rush, and he was the most prominent physician in England. He actually met Paine, and they became good friends in that very same bookstore that I mentioned earlier, where Paine went to work to found this magazine. And Paine would show rough drafts of common sense to Benjamin Rush. But how did Benjamin Rush came back from England, penniless, unknown, and set up practice in Philadelphia? Well, how do you set up a practice in a big city? I mean, how would you do it today? You couldn't do it. You couldn't just get an office and set up practice. But you could in Philadelphia because you could walk one end of the city to the other, and shopkeepers, they didn't have shops in the sense that they have. They'd stand at the doorway with a sign that said a butcher or a baker or everything, and people would pass by, they'd chat, and they'd get to know each other. So this was village life, an extended form of what we have to call village life in those days. And that's how things got started, and people would get to know each other. I'm not sure if that answered your question.
It does, but I had a second part of it, which is in the Declaration of Independence. Can we say that, which ideas can we attribute to Thomas Paine? Anything, can we say that that was, one line or another was definitely Thomas Paine, or it was a milieu of ideas of which he was part?
Well, most of the Declaration of Independence is very boring, because after the third or fourth paragraph, it says the king has, and then they list one after another, 40 or 50 terrible things that the king had done to the Americans. And even if he hadn't done them, Thomas Jefferson thought that he hadn't. The Declaration of Independence, most of the first few paragraphs had already been written by Richard Henry Lee several weeks before. And Congress decided they needed, and it was only a 2-paragraph declaration. Congress decided they needed something more, a greater document, because they felt this was a historic moment. So they appointed a committee of 5, which included Franklin, Adams, John Adams, Jefferson, and I've forgotten the other 2. But Jefferson was the youngster. The others were quite old. They had been sitting in Congress for weeks on end. They were exhausted. They took that little document of Richard Henry Lee and decided verbally on what they'd like to see in the rest of the document. And they turned the job over to this youngster, Thomas Jefferson. Well, Jefferson had read John Locke's Rights of Man, which were written decades earlier in the 18th century. And he really plagiarized the John Locke's Rights of Man. All men are created equal. They are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. That's almost straight out of John Locke. And then, as I said, then is a list of grievances. The king has done this, done that, he's done that. And then at the end, final paragraph that Jefferson did write, his own writing, we pledge our lives, our fortunes, our sacred honor. Well, Jefferson actually didn't give a penny, so he may have pledged his fortune, but he didn't do much about his sacred honor, and he never even fired a shot in the Revolutionary War. After the document was signed, he rode home to his mansion in Charlottesville, Charlottesville, Virginia, in the western part, well, the mid part of the state, up on a mountain somewhere, and never fired a shot at the British. he hid. He really just hid during the war. He was scared to death. So he violated his own pledge. So Thomas Paine really had less to do with the Declaration than he did with the spirit, inflaming the spirit of rebellion at that time. Everybody in Congress, they were all literate, of course, had read Common Sense, so they were deeply affected by it. Influential people in not in every part of the country, because the South was not really for independence. Tobacco had become a craze in England and Western Europe, so they were making fortunes selling tobacco to England, and they did not want that trade disrupted. And indeed, British loyalists, organized militias in the South to fight the other American rebels. There was a major battle outside of Wilmington, North Carolina. Wilmington was a big import-export center. And these were tobacco farmers that did not want to end their relationship with England. They were living off the trade, tobacco trade. It was far from universal, but before England actually granted independence, they organized shiploads from various port cities for loyalists who were afraid they'd be massacred once independence was actually proclaimed. And 1,000 loyalists sailed out of New York Harbor to Halifax in Canada to fleeing when George Washington and his troops entered Manhattan Island.
Well, we have a couple excellent questions. The first one is the following. Thomas Paine was well known for his directness and simplicity of his language, which was unusual at the time. The writer doesn't say this, but so was Benjamin Franklin, very direct and clear in his writing, not flowery at all. And that's one of the things that makes his words resonate, I think, through the centuries. But can you talk about how and why he developed his style of writing, and why, if any, reaction it provoked in his time? And what, if any, reaction?
Well, part of the premise is incorrect. Well known is not the right word. Again, there were no communications in those days. Communications were by horseback. So people in the western regions and the southern regions, some of them had never heard of Thomas Paine. There were only about a dozen and a half newspapers, and these were in major population centers. They never got to the rural areas where people couldn't read or write and never saw a newspaper. So the idea of thinking that communication systems, the ease of communication of the 20th and 21st centuries, and even the last half of the 19th century, that didn't exist. You have to imagine people almost living like a large proportion of people, almost living like hermits, without any contact with limited contact with the outside world. No government. They governed their own farms and plantations. If squatters came along, they'd shoot them. And that spirit of needing a gun to defend yourself still exists among millions of Americans. I'm sure you're aware of that. as for the tone of his language, so his stuff only reached literate people. And in a population of 2.5 million people, perhaps 5% were literate. And they were used, they had already read. Remember, he was not the only provocative writer. Before him, Jean-Jacques Rousseau in France had written The Social Contract, which went across the Western world. It was banned in England, just like Paine's stuff was banned in England. But Rousseau was far better known than Paine, and had far greater influence. You know, it begins, man was born free, and everywhere he is in chains. And that is provocative, or it was in those days. I mean, to me, it's still provocative. So that was far better known than Paine's work, certainly internationally, and probably among the intelligentsia, limited number of members of the intelligentsia in America. The very wealthiest people in America sent their sons to England to study. Many went to Oxford, many went to Edinburgh, which was a great university at that time. A few went to France, but they were studying French in England because England and France had been intertwined in war for centuries. So the literate Englishman spoke French and the literate Frenchman spoke English. But so Paine's words simply were another inflammatory writer among many at the time. His had more influence in the United States, largely because of Franklin and his friends in Philadelphia. He settled in the right city. And then he gained international fame, not so, partially through his words. He wrote The Rights of Man, which was banned in England. More importantly, he, as I said, was deeply interested in scientific areas of that day, and especially construction. And he became a self-taught designer of iron arch bridges. In America, everything went by barge or horse and carriage, but large quantities had to go by barge. And so they had to travel streams and rivers. And it was very difficult. The only bridges at the time were flat wooden bridges that crossed. So if a barge had too much cargo on it, it would have to unload the cargo, sail into the bridge, and reload the cargo. Paine came up with this design of an arched bridge where all of the weight was on the feet of the arch at either end. It was brilliant at the time. It was revolutionary, and but it was very expensive. The iron was very expensive. Someone in England invented wrought iron, and that made it less expensive. But he became internationally famous for his bridges. And Benjamin Franklin, that's how he got to England and France. Benjamin Franklin, Congress turned it down. It was too expensive. Congress was not going to subsidize these bridges. And Paine went to England first on the urging of Benjamin Franklin, saying the English are Parliament's far more forward-looking, and they would be interested in this, so are the French. So he went to England, and he dealt with an English iron construction firm, and they built a sample iron bridge that was mounted and in a field in what is now Paddington, which was then a suburb. And thousands of important English people, representatives of various counties, wealthy landowners came to look at this bridge and promised him orders. And then he went to Paris, and again, a big display of the bridge. The French were looking at ways of building better bridges across the Seine River and other rivers. They loved his design. And then he ran into trouble writing the Rights of Man, and that got him kicked out of England. He gets to France, and the French Revolution starts over there. So the bridge never came to anything. The builder of that sample bridge pulled it down and later rebuilt it, and it was built across the Wear River in England, but it was a Thomas Paine bridge, and it was pioneering development in engineering, and that added to his fame, especially in Europe.
I think we've got time for this final question here. Paine's ideas on religion have gained currency in our age, the writer says, with modern writers such as Christopher Hitchens praising the age of reason as a template for plural societies. Do you think we are ready for a Paine Renaissance?
No, not with the strength of evangelical Christian beliefs in the United States. The powers of organized religion are just too great to permit that kind of to allow dissemination of those ideas. As I say, he trashes the savages all of the fundamental beliefs as mythology in all of these religions. And the organized religions will not tolerate it on one hand, and so far the American publishers won't tolerate it. They're not going to take the chance of having millions of Americans boycott all of their books by publishing one controversial book. Actually, you can buy Age of Reason. I know I checked this morning to make sure you can get it on Amazon. I didn't bother to check who the publishers were, but that would be interesting to see who actually published it. This edition here that I have, I never heard of the publisher, called Forgotten Books. So it's being published, but certainly not by mainline publishers, or maybe it is surreptitiously under other imprints that doesn't implicate them in the publication of anti-religious books. Now, I don't think there are too many Americans that even agnostics, certainly not agnostics, but even atheists who would support spread of the ideas in the pronouncements and ideas that pronouncements of Age of Reason, because it will just alienate a lot of people without convincing them. I mean, you're not going to convince people that Christ does not exist. You're not going to convince people that there is no God. Period. Just like you're not going to convince people that Trump did not win the election. People love mythology, and they have for centuries. It gives them comfort, and it precedes anything that Thomas Paine wrote. I'm sure there were many who said that the pronouncements at Delphi were pure garbage, but not many Greeks bought that. You don't see anything in the history books about those who said, no, it's not true. They're saying at Delphi.
Well, before we thank you formally, Harlow, let me just say that today's a very auspicious day for Benjamin Franklin House. Not only did we have your fascinating remarks about your book on Thomas Paine, but we also have digitally published our first podcast which we hope people will listen to. You can find that on our website. It's called Frank, and then in brackets, LIN, Franklin Views. And our first interviewee is the American business leader and historian of American history and more, and also a journalist himself, David Rubenstein. And you can also find that on Bloomberg Connects, which is a free app. And you can visit the Benjamin Franklin pages on Bloomberg Connects. We come toward the front of that, and it's a wonderful way to get a behind the scenes tour of Benjamin Franklin House and lots of other places as well. And let me just flag that our next event will be Franklin in Portraits with Carrie Deepthorne, Senior Curator and Chief of Museum Branch of Independence National Historical Park in Philadelphia, who will discuss Charles Wilson Peele's Portrait of Benjamin Franklin. This is part of our Franklin in Portraits exhibition on Bloomberg Connects. And she will be discussing that with Dr. George Boudreau, a great friend of Benjamin Franklin House, on the significance. But let me just remind everyone that Harlow's book is Thomas Paine and the Clarion Call for American Independence. Harlow, thank you so much for being with us today. And could you just give us a word on what your next book is going to be on, so that we look forward to you coming back to talk to us?
I'm very glad you asked that. I just happen to have a copy of it right here.
Oh, great.
It's called the Magic Money Man. It's a biography. It's a very short biography, but a really action-packed biography of Robert Morris, who was one of the only two people who signed all three of American documents. He was actually born in the slums of Liverpool and found his way to America with penniless. And because he had grown up along the docks, he had gotten a sense of how trading was done. Little by little, he accumulated, by the time he was in his 20s, the largest fortune in America. He became America's richest man. So rich that when Congress went bankrupt during the War of Independence, Washington turned to Morris, and Morris financed. He was called by Congress the financier because he financed the entire Revolutionary War. He paid the troops out of his own pockets. And Washington called him, because whenever Washington needed money, he turned to Morris, and Washington called him the Magic Money Man. And it's spelled the way Washington spelled it in his documents, with a K, M-A-G-I-C-K. And it's available now in the UK, actually, through Amazon. So it's a very short but exciting book.
Wonderful. Well, we will hold you to that, coming back to talk to us about the Magic Money Men. And thank you again for being with us. It was absolutely fascinating. And thanks to everyone who joined us today. We really appreciate your time. Thank you.